Well, Duncan and the previous panel set a high bar on timeliness and content, and I know this panel will do the same. I'm Dr. Larry McKinney. I'm the director of the Heart Research Institute, and I want to first of all thank our other co-sponsors for putting this forum together, and particularly the Baker Institute for hosting it in their wonderful facility. Rather than go through the lengthy introduction of our speakers, I apologize to them now for not doing that. It's in your program. I know you'd rather hear from them. As you listen to them, you'll recognize that you'll know that they are qualified, but certainly you can look at that and look at their impressive backgrounds. And we're very pleased and thankful that the panel could join us. But it's a fairly large panel, and so we'll be trying to be timely. And what we've agreed to do is try to keep remarks to that 10 to 12 minute session. We'll go through the opening remarks from the panel in order in the program, and then as we have time for questions, which we hope to do, we will follow up with those as well. Let me first introduce our first speaker, and the title that to be working from is the Transboundary Hydrocarbon Treaty, International and Legal Issues, Dr. Richard McLaughlin. Rich is the Endowed Chair for Coastal and Marine Policy and Law at HRI. We're very proud to have him as part of our institute. He keeps us very much attuned with this issue, and of course these issues are of great importance to the Heart Research Institute when we focus on the Gulf of Mexico, and we like to say the entire Gulf of Mexico, recognizing there's not just the north or the south, but there's both, and this is one of those boundary issues that is very intriguing. So at this time, I'll just introduce Rich and let you take on.
Thank you, Larry. Before Guillermo Garcia and I talk about the 2012 Transboundary Hydrocarbon Agreement, I just wanted to also thank the co-sponsors and also the Center for U.S. and Mexican Law at the University of Houston, as well as the Heart Institute, for funding the research that we'll be talking about. If you are interested, the first article is going to be published this spring in the University of Houston Journal of International Law. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I think the way that we're going to organize this presentation is I will be speaking first. I will talk to you a little bit about why the United States and Mexico felt it necessary to negotiate this transboundary agreement. And then Guillermo will step in and talk about the agreement itself. We'll see if this is working. Oh, good, it is. Before we talk about any activity in the ocean, we have to, I think, understand what I believe is the most important, and I think most of my colleagues would also agree, is the most important multilateral international treaty ever negotiated, and that's the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, I say it's the most important for several reasons. First, it involved every nation on Earth, including landlocked nations, participating in the negotiations. And second, it was based on a consensus approach, which is extraordinarily unusual in this arena. Generally, when you're negotiating multilateral treaties, you are using supermajorities. If 3/4 or 2/3 of the delegates agree to particular language, then it's incorporated into the treaty. This was not the case in this convention. Every word of every provision in that treaty had to be agreed upon by every participating nation. And as a consequence of that process, which took 10 long years, this treaty became what is known as instantaneous customary law. And the importance of that is the fact that even if you are not a state party to the convention, you are bound by the provisions within that convention. Now, Mexico is a party and a strong proponent of the convention. The United States, as most of you know, is not a party. But that is not that important to our discussion today, because the United States has recognized that it is a customary international law. At least something like 98% of it is customary international law. All of the issues that we're going to be talking about today are agreed upon by the United States. Now, the way this treaty works is that it creates a series of marine juridical zones extending from the coastline of nations all the way out into the middle of the ocean. And the underlying premise or theme is that coastal nations should have more authority closer to their shores, and then as you move further and further out into the ocean, then the international community begins to acquire more and more rights and authority. Now, for our purposes, I think the most important of these juridical zones is the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which is a creation of this treaty. And what that basically says is that coastal nations have the exclusive authority to explore and exploit any natural resource within 200 miles of nautical miles of its shoreline. And this includes both living resources, fisheries, for example, and non-living. Hydrocarbons are also included in that. Past the exclusive economic zone is the continental shelf. And this allows nations to actually claim beyond 200 miles, all the way out to potentially 350 miles. And I will show you a map in the Gulf of Mexico where both the United States and Mexico have actually claimed extended continental shelf in that region and the impacts of that. When you extend beyond the continental shelf, then you're talking about international waters, where on the seabed, that is where the principle of common heritage of humankind applies, where the resources are basically owned by the entire world, shared by the world. And then in the water column above that, those are subject to the freedom of the seas. They're basically owned by no one. Anyone can exploit those resources. So if we turn now to a global map of exclusive economic zones, this will show you the importance. And that is, in our particular region, the wider Caribbean region, it is one continuous overlapping patchwork of exclusive economic zones. If you're going to engage in hydrocarbon development, you are going to engage in the process of asking permission and consent from some coastal nation within the region. If we look more carefully at the Gulf of Mexico itself, you can see that almost the entire Gulf is subject to the exclusive economic zones of either the United States, Mexico, or Cuba. However, there are a couple of exceptions to that, areas that extend beyond national jurisdiction. The first of these is the Eastern Gap. This is an area that has not been delineated to date, and the reason for that is because Cuba is involved. And whenever Cuba is involved, the United States is not going to be involved. Now, that might be changing with the thawing of relations that we've just found out about, but it's unlikely. I have a feeling this is not going to be delineated, and we're not going to be dealing with that particular area anytime soon. In contrast, the Western Gap has been delineated. That is the product of a treaty between the United States and Mexico in 2000. And the important aspect of this is that this is one of the areas where the United States' non-membership in the Law of the Sea Convention is important. And that's because if you engage in development, production in one of these extended continental shelf areas, then there is a requirement to pay some additional royalties to the International Seabed Authority. So if the United States does become a party, it will have to comply with that requirement. If it doesn't, then there's a lot of legal uncertainty, but they don't have to pay those royalties. Now, the Transboundary agreement between the two nations applies for this entire maritime boundary. The only exception is the fact that it does not apply within 9 nautical miles of the Texas coast. And that's because under US law, Texas controls the natural resources within its state waters, which extend out to 9 nautical miles. So if a hydrocarbon resource is located within 3 nautical miles either side of this maritime boundary, from this point through the Western Gap to the western tip of the Eastern Gap, then it is required to comply with the provisions in the new 2012 Transboundary Agreement. The concern and the reason why this agreement was thought necessary, the impetus of this agreement, was an area known as the Perdido Fold Belt or Alaminos Canyon, located right about here, right along the maritime boundary. And this is a map of that from the perception of Pemex. And as you can see, at least from Pemex's standpoint, there are a number of reservoirs of hydrocarbons that straddle the maritime boundary that could create this issue of one side or the other siphoning off some of that resource. And as a result, this has become an area of special concern. This is not a new phenomenon. This issue of exploiting transboundary hydrocarbons. It's been going on for decades. There are a number of nations, although the United States and Mexico have never done this, other nations have. And as a consequence, there are a series of customary international rules that have developed when you're dealing with these transboundary resources. And probably, you know, the best way to describe this is a doctrine of mutual restraint. And what it basically provides is that if you are going to exploit a transboundary resource, then you first have to negotiate in good faith to try to reach an agreement with the sharing party. If you cannot reach that agreement, then neither party can unilaterally exploit the resource to the detriment of the sharing party. Now, that's where it gets a bit murky. We know that you can't do anything to damage or hurt or to the detriment of the sharing party, but we don't know exactly what would be allowed and would not be allowed in order to accomplish that. And so there have been a number of suggestions. We've talked about many in our article, but there is no firm established customary rule regarding what you do under those circumstances. And in fact, that is exactly what Mexico and the United States had to do in this treaty, was to determine how they go about exploiting those, potentially exploiting those resources if they can't come to a unitization agreement between the parties. Now, this customary rule has been supported in a number of international court decisions. It's been supported by a number of provisions within the Law of the Sea Convention. The Law of the Sea Convention makes it very clear that this is not specifically related to hydrocarbons. In fact, that convention goes out of its way to never use the term hydrocarbons because of its controversial nature and the fact that it's likely going to bring up sovereign rights issues that are very sensitive. But what it does is it provides a number of more general supporting provisions saying you have to cooperate under these circumstances. When you have transboundary resources, you must cooperate. And even more so when you're in a semi-enclosed sea like the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the reason why, the international legal reason why we have this transboundary agreement. So this is the foundation. I'll now turn it over to my colleague Guillermo Garcia, who will then talk about the treaty itself and the provisions in that treaty. All right. We're a team. We're a team.
Thank you. Do you have the... Thank you so much, Richard, for this introduction to the international aspect of the article that we are preparing or going to be publishing. I'm just going to jump directly because there are a lot of things to discuss. So the 2012 Transboundary Agreement between the United States and Mexico has a lot of provisions, and there are a lot of elements that could be analyzed today, but naturally we don't have the time. But there is two things that you can take out of my presentation. It's the following. So number one, there are three different legal regimes operating in the Gulf of Mexico. On the one side is naturally the US side. There's the energy reform that we just recently discussed, and I'm going to go over it a little bit. And then is a treaty of 2012. And that treaty operates right in the borderline only for those fields that pass the borderline, that can be exploited from both sides technically. Now, what does this mean? It creates basically a basis for cooperation, but at the same time, it keeps the regulatory aspects of both nations operating in some aspects. So you have almost like a layered regulatory regime operating the borderline. I'm going to see how complex that eventually gets. The second point that you can take out of my presentation, our presentation, is that the energy reform and the treaty are a good step forward in this cooperation, but naturally there are things that were left on the side. And there are things that we still have to work towards. Particularly, and one of the things that we think happened was that the Mexicans, when they were negotiating this treaty, it took them 10 years to reach an agreement with the United States. And they were negotiating under the previous energy sector regime in Mexico, where Pemex had a monopoly. So the things that were being negotiated, they never even imagined, and that's what's an important aspect, they didn't even imagine what was coming up. So they always left the possibility in the agreement to do a unilateral exploitation if the parties couldn't reach an agreement on how to exploit it in a joint way. And that's something that deviates from the practice that Richard just explained to us, and I'm going to go into more detail of how that affects the contractual relationships and the operations in the borderline. So first I'm going to describe the treaty, then I'm going to describe the energy reform slightly, because we did a great job in the previous panel, and then I'm going to explain how these interact with each other. Oh, there you go. Just in case you were missing the 2 points. So in the borderline, naturally we have the border. And then on the US side, we have BOM with the license contracts. On the Mexican side, we have the regime that we have just been explained. So this treaty basically operates when the transboundary field is located. And both licenses, and the first thing that the treaty stipulates is that there's an obligation to report from both sides and share information. So immediately when one of the licensees identifies there is a transboundary resource, it must notify its authority on each side. And that authority at the same time has to notify the Mexican authority or the US authority on the other side. And they have to share the information, share the reports, share the development plans, and immediately the next obligation is that they have to start negotiating what is called a unitization agreement. This means that the field has to be treated as a unit. This means that both sides can cross the border, technically, and do exploration and exploitation wells from both sides and try to figure out the most efficient point of exploiting the field for the benefit of both sides. So they start, naturally, this is a process of negotiation between the private parties. Once they reach an agreement, then the governments have to approve that unitization agreement, and they have to approve the allocation of resources that the parties reach. In case they cannot reach an allocation of resources, they can talk to an expert, and the expert can come with a decision that is final and binding for the parties. There's also each licensee maintains its own fiscal regime, so this is important to notice because it's going to affect the negotiation chips from the parties because they will have different benefits and utilities depending on the fiscal regime in which they're going to be operating. The treaty also creates a joint commission that has one member from each country designated. The tasks of the joint commissions first is to interpret the treaty, resolve disputes that arise out of the treaty, and also propose allocation in case the parties cannot reach an agreement before the expert gets involved. They can also propose the allocation of the resources. And most importantly, now that we saw earlier, it also has to come up with regulatory frameworks for safety and environmental issues in the borderline. One of the strange things about the commission is that it's only 2 members. So you can imagine what happens when there is a deadlock. There's no solution. Eventually, if they cannot reach an agreement, there's also a chance for go to arbitration, international arbitration. Unfortunately, the treaty is also atypical in this aspect because it doesn't state that the arbitration is binding, it doesn't state that the arbitration is obligatory, it doesn't state the rules of arbitration, the amount of arbitrators. Basically, it just only says that the parties may, if they wish, go to arbitration. So this is also atypical when we analyze other international treaties that deal with this type of issues. So this is a map, you've seen it many times, but as you can see, there's already some fields that are located around the borderline. This is the US side, and this is the Mexican side. I'm going to go into details. So the Mexican energy reform, I'm just going to swing through this, but I think it's important to have it very clear again. So there are 2 types of contractual possibilities for exploiting fields in the Gulf of Mexico. The assignments that we just saw were basically CENER, which is the Ministry of Energy, with the aid and support of the National Commission of Hydrocarbons, signs an agreement with Pemex for particular blocks. In round 1, for example, 83% of the proven and probable reserves of Mexico and 21% of the prospective reserves were designated to Pemex through assignments. And then Pemex can sign service contracts with private parties in cash. So this is basically the previous regime that we had in Mexico. It's maintained. And as you just saw, these service contracts, in some cases, they can be migrated into exploration and production agreements, contracts, sorry. Then the second type of contractual relationship, it's the exploration and production contracts, where you basically have now the Ministry of Energy. They design the contract and assign a particular contract to a particular block. It's up to them to decide which type of contract it's going to be. Then you have the Ministry of Finance coming up with the royalties and the taxes and all the compensations that are around the contract. And then you have the National Commission on Hydrocarbons that does the tendering process and does the signing. So you see the complexity here. And then also you have, it's not in the map, but you also have the new Environmental Regulatory Agency. And they sign the agreement with the private parties. As you know, service contracts, the EIP contracts can be service contracts, profit sharing contracts, production sharing contracts, license contracts. Each one of these has different type of royalties, compensations, and liabilities. So for example, service contracts is in cash considerations, profit sharing and production sharing have exploration fees, royalties, and percentage of profit to be determined through the tendering process. The license contracts, they have a bonus on execution and percentage of the value of production, and in all of the cases, they have an adjustment mechanism to, in case the rent is so extraordinary, the government of Mexico can capture that rent to the adjustment mechanism. And they also, all of them have the local content that also has to be determined in the tender process. So how does this energy reform operate under the treaty? So again, we have the US side. Then we have these three agencies plus the environmental agency coming up together in a process. They eventually sign a contract with a private party, or public companies can be associated in case Pemex associates with them. Then you find the transboundary resource. Again, they have to come up to a process of negotiation to reach a unitization agreement. And the energy reform includes a provision where then if that happens, the private licensee from the Mexican side has to sign an association agreement with Pemex, where Pemex has at least a 20% participation. So what we're seeing here is a negotiation between private parties, and then a negotiation with Pemex with this private party, and all of this has to be approved by both sides, meaning both governments. Then also the Joint Commission in the middle, participating, and in case they cannot reach an agreement, in terms of the allocation, you have the expert. What happens if they cannot reach an agreement? This is the atypical part of the treaty. Basically says that each party can exploit the field unilaterally. Is this efficient? Technically, it's very hard to achieve an efficient exploitation of a particular field where you cannot actually see the whole field, because you're not allowed to cross the border. You cannot share the cost of the exploration wells. You cannot share the information. Each party is going to be operating on its own. There's a risk even of collapsing the field if they don't do it in a coordinated way. So basically, the treaty is leaving the possibility of an inefficient exploitation of the field. Now, naturally, there's a lot of steps before we reach that point, but there is the possibility there. The only thing that we have left is the allocation of the resources. That's a positive aspect. That's binding. So if the expert decides there's a percentage from each side, that's binding for the licensees. Now, one of the things that was also left out of the treaty is that the current license that were signed before the treaty was approved, they cannot be, there's no obligation from the states to renegotiate those licenses. So particularly from the US side, the current licenses, if there happens to be a transboundary resource located there, the treaty is silent about what happens. There's no compensation, even if they have been already operating the field. If it happened to be that they were exploiting Mexican fields, there's no compensation mechanism or anything of such a thing. As you know, the Gulf of Mexico is quite developed on the US side, but on the positive side, on the Mexican side, there's a lot of possibilities. It's quite, especially deep water fields are quite underdeveloped. And in the round one, these are the ones that are already being planned, as we just saw from the presentation from Luis. And you can see these three of them, at least they're already putting a provision that they have to have an association with Pemex. So this basically means that the government feels that they will probably have transboundary resources, so they're moving one step ahead and forcing the parties to associate with Pemex in that section. So I think we're out of time.
Perfect time.
But we're open for many questions because I guess there's going to be questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I think now as Yerma talked about, the U.S. side is obviously being more developed, and so we're going to focus in on the U.S. policies and BOEM policies, and so we're very happy to have Robert Sebastian to take that on. Thank you very much. Turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. How do I progress to the right? Yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this morning about this. I was telling Guillermo and Richard last night at dinner that about once a week my phone rings and it's somebody kind of frantic and says, you know, I have this question I need to ask you, and I just really hope you can help me with this. And about 9 out of 10 times it's about the Transboundary Agreement. And it's on everybody's mind, and there's been a lot of confusion and misunderstanding over the years. The diplomatic part of it, the agreements have been in transition. And at the same time, the U.S. leasing policy has not always been completely in sync with what's happening, you know, on the diplomatic front. So what I want to do today is just explain a little bit, try to clarify, you know, first of all, the geographic context that Richard went into a little bit already, and then a little bit of the historical context leading up to the effective date of the agreement, how that's impacted the U.S. leasing program, and then a little bit, you know, about what's being done so far on the implementation of the agreement between BOEM and Bessie. So once again, the transboundary area, I think a lot of people believe the transboundary area is only the part of the Gulf within the Western Gap, but it's actually, you know, the 550-mile strip that Richard mentioned a few minutes ago, you know, beyond Texas waters and through the Western Gap into the western edge of the Eastern Gap. And then the Western Gap that, of course, was delimited by the Treaty of 2000, what we refer to as the Western Gap Treaty, 4.2 million acres, and about 1.5 million acres of that is on the U.S. side of the former Western Gap. And then the moratorium area, when the Treaty of 2000, the Western Gap Treaty, was signed, they were concerned about having time to reach an agreement on the transboundary resources. And so there was a temporary moratorium on a 1.4 nautical mile area on either side of the boundary within the Western Gap. Some people call that the buffer zone. And so that's about 135-mile distance across the gap. So same map that Richard showed a few minutes ago, but you see the 550-mile area from the Eastern Gap all the way to the state waters of Texas. And of course, the agreement specifically defines a transboundary reservoir as, you know, first of all, lying at least 9 miles from the coast of Texas. So anything in the Texas waters straddling the Mexican border would not be considered a transboundary reservoir. And just to give you a perspective, once again, of how that looks on a current active leasing map in the central and western Gulf of Mexico, you can see the former Western Gap with a number of leases in the northern portion, no current activity actually on the border, and then the Eastern Gap, which is, of course, is completely deferred and off limits from leasing for the time being until we might reach a similar agreement there. So with that geographic context, you know, what happened? Of course, the Western Gap Treaty of 2000, and as soon as that was signed, then the former MMS made plans immediately to start offering acreage in that area in Gulf of Mexico Sale 178 and Gulf of Mexico Sale 180, held in August of 2001. But actually, strangely enough, there had been leasing within the Western Gap prior to that time. There was actually leasing allowed from about 1983 to 1997. And there's actually a couple of existing leases within that area, actually transboundary leases that were actually issued around 1995. So it's been a little inconsistent in the treatment of that area. And then, as I mentioned, there was a 10-year moratorium on leasing within a 1.4 nautical mile area, only within the Western Gap, which was also interesting because, as you can see, there's actually no leasing on that area, you know, within the Western Gap, but rather, you know, much further to the west. And but anyway, the 10-mile moratorium gave us, time to work with Mexico to actually reach the Transboundary Agreement. And so in 2012, after negotiations probably started intensely happening around 2010, but it was 2012 when we finally signed the agreement with Mexico in Los Cabos. And, the Transboundary Agreement is actually not exactly a treaty. It's called a Congressional Executive Agreement, which means that it has to be approved by both houses of Congress as well as the executive branch. And so in this kind of interim period between the time that the agreement was signed in 2012 and the time it actually became effective in 2014, we had to adjust our lease sale terms accordingly. And so we had 2 or 3 lease sales where there was uncertainty as to whether, before the sale or shortly after the sale, the agreement would actually come into full force and effect if Congress approved it. So that was about a 2.5-year period. And so we had some kind of wiggle words in the sale notices that said, if, within 6 months, from this sale, we reach an agreement, we may or may not open the bids and that kind of thing. And we actually had one sale in 2012. That was sale 229 in the Western Gulf of Mexico, where we had a special procedure where I was the only one to receive bids in the Transboundary area. They weren't reported. I actually held those bids for a period of 6 months, and those were eventually returned because the agreement still was not looking like it was going to get approved. And in the same time, the area, of course, within the 1.4 nautical mile buffer zone remained completely deferred from leasing. And so finally, in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013, Congress approved the agreement. And you see the language in Section 303 of the Act stating that the agreement signed at Los Cabos in February 20th, 2012 is hereby approved. But that wasn't really the end of it, because we still had to do something called exchange of diplomatic notes. These are very formal communications between the governments. And that's an example of the U.S. side note to Mexico acknowledging that we received their diplomatic notes, and accordingly, we also agreed that we're ready for the agreement to come into full force and effect. And according to the terms of the agreement, then it became effective 60 days later. So the notes were exchanged on May the 19th of 2014, and the agreement actually entered into full force and effect on July the 18th of 2014. So what's so important about this? Before the agreement, there was no mechanism for operating across the border, sharing resources, cooperating in a joint operating agreement, or any of those kinds of things. It was really left up to the common law rule of capture. And so now we have this mechanism. It's still somewhat undefined, but we have a good framework in the Transboundary Agreement to provide for primarily, voluntary unitization between operators on the U.S. and the Mexican side. And so what were the impacts on the U.S. side? They were a certain number of leases that pre-existed the agreement, and those are specifically mentioned in the agreement as being not subject to the terms of the Transboundary Agreement. But it does say that U.S. or both sides have to make a good faith effort to bring those leases under the terms of the agreement. There was about 13 such leases when we signed the agreement. There's about 9 left now because 3 of them were relinquished and 1 of them expired. And we've contacted those lessees and asked them if they wanted to opt into the agreement. None of them have said yes, but none of them have said no so far. I think they're taking kind of a wait and see attitude to see how things develop. And but the importance of that is that, without being under the terms of that agreement, they will not be able to avail themselves of the unitization agreement that's provided by the terms of the agreement. Any new leases will automatically be subject to the agreement. That started with sale really 233 in the Western Gulf of Mexico in 2013. There's a special stipulation that we attached to the agreement. The obligations are really for the U.S. to do this and do that under the terms of the agreement. And what the stipulation does is it requires the lessees and operators to, comply with and cooperate with, BOEM or BSEE as they, fulfill the obligations of the agreement. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013 also actually amended the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act and specifically talks about implementation of the specific transboundary agreement with Mexico, and says that the Secretary may take any actions necessary to implement the terms of the agreement. And it specifically mentioned approving unitization agreements and related arrangements, exchanging non-proprietary information, and taking actions consistent with an expert determination. Because under the agreement, actually the expert determination is a binding decision on about 3 matters in terms of determination of a transboundary reservoir, allocation of production, or reallocation of production. So implementation is still ongoing. It's really just beginning. The agreement is really, to me, just a framework. It's a very good one, but there's many details, processes, and procedures to work out. One of the main ones is to develop the model unitization agreements that will be used. We're currently working on that, and of course using our Gulf of Mexico unitization agreement models to as a starting point. We have to draft and adopt Joint Commission rules of procedures, establish these dispute resolution mechanisms, joint inspections, and we're supposed to, quote, harmonize safety and environmental standards, and then review our oil spill preparedness and response, make sure that we have ongoing cooperation. So what's happened so far? As I said, the authority to implement the agreement was delegated to the Secretary of the Interior. There's provisions in the agreement for designation of a, quote, executive agency on each side. There's also a requirement to designate a representative to the Joint Commission that's a dispute resolution group. So the Secretarial Order number 3333, which was effective on June 3rd, 2014, actually delegated the authority to implement the agreement to the Department of Interior itself. But at the same time, it said that the functions of the executive agency would actually be carried out by BOEM and BSEE, and there's an exhibit to that order that article by article says whether each responsibility is BOEM, BSEE, or a joint responsibility between BOEM and BSEE. And it also named the DOI Deputy Secretary as the representative and the Assistant Secretary of Land and Minerals Management as the alternate representative to the Joint Commission. The order also required BOEM and BSEE to enter into a memorandum of understanding to further delineate the roles and responsibilities of each agency. And we did that, and we signed that agreement effective July 17, 2014, the day before the Transboundary Agreement actually became effective. And both of these documents are actually online on the BSEE website. And I would recommend that you take a look at both of them, because especially the MOU will give you a very good idea in some circumstances of not only whose responsibility each item in the agreement is, but also a little bit how BOEM and BSEE are going to approach the implementation and or even interpret the agreement. So it's a great document to take a look at. What have we done so far? We had one meeting back in June in Mexico City, and this was really kind of a meet and greet and get to know one another. There have been so many changes in personnel on both sides, from the U.S. and Mexico side. We met for a couple of days and just sort of kicked around what we were going to do to begin the implementation of the agreement. In December, we had another meeting in Washington, and I call this an Article 4 consultation, because under Article 4 of the agreement, we have an obligation to consult with Mexico within 90 days after the effective date of the agreement, and also annually thereafter, and that's to exchange actually non-proprietary geological information from both sides. And so we've done that. We met for, I guess, a full day. And then, the intent is to break into smaller teams going forward so that we can address all the things on the list I just mentioned, beginning with drafting up the unitization agreements. What's happened from the leasing side, you'll see that sale 233 was one of the ones where we had the special language in the sale notice. We received those bids in August of 2013, but we didn't actually open them until March 19, 2014, because it wasn't until about that time that we were certain that the agreement was going to be in full force and effect. And there was only 3 bids submitted in that sale, and those were all by ExxonMobil. And 3 leases were awarded in the Alamitos Canyon area as a result of that sale. And following year in 2014, we had Western Gulf of Mexico sale 238. And you can see that we had a much more robust response at the lease sale. We had 24 bids in the Western sale and $28 million in high bids by BP, BHP, Stone Energy, and Exxon. And as a result of that sale, we had 24 leases awarded. So a big difference between the uncertainty the year before and then the certainty following the effective date of the agreement. Next, we're going to have sale 235. That's actually just in a few weeks in March. That's going to be the first Central Gulf of Mexico sale that will be held after the effective date of the agreement, and actually the first one to offer blocks within the former 1.4 nautical mile moratorium area that terminated when the agreement became effective. We did another thing. There's actually, I guess, another geographical feature that I have to mention, and because of the agreement, we have the quote, the Transboundary 3 statute mile line, and for the U.S. side, that drives which OCS blocks are actually subject to the agreement, and because they're described as any blocks, located or partially located in that area within 3 statute miles from the maritime boundary. And that line is also important under Article 4 because it determines the notification obligations on each side under Article 4. I think Guillermo mentioned that there's notifications when a plan is filed, an exploration or development plan is filed, application for a permit to drill, any kind of seismic permit is filed, and finally, if there's a determination of the likely existence of a transboundary reservoir in that area. So we actually had to go through this exercise and amend our maps, and those were just published just a few weeks ago in the Federal Register. And you can see just at the very bottom, hopefully you can see the 3 statute mile line there. And so these are now available, so everybody who's operating that area and wants to bid will know automatically kind of where they stand as regards, the applicability of the Transboundary Agreement. And finally, kind of an updated leasing map. You can see to the area to the right, there's some kind of dark red blocks. Those are the Exxon blocks that were bid at sale 233 and 238. And then to the west side, there's also, a lot more blocks that were bid on in sale 238. And so now there's a total of 27 new leases that are definitely subject to the agreement. And there's 9 existing leases that are shown in the kind of the pink area there. Those are the existing leases that are not, currently subject to the agreement. And the little shaded in area there, the blue, the dark blue, is actually, just a historical reference. That was where the 1.4 nautical mile buffer zone applied, of no activity until the agreement came into full force and effect. And all of the shaded area in the light blue actually shows which blocks we've determined are subject to the Transboundary Agreement. So those are determined by that 3 statute mile line that I just mentioned. And finally, just to show you a little bit about the importance and the proximity of, some of the key plays, Great White, in the Perdido Fold Belt, and Silvertip and Tobago, not exactly on the transboundary line, but relatively close. And I think this is the same map that Richard showed a few minutes ago that shows the juxtaposition of the key discoveries on the Mexican side, the Trion and the Supremus especially, and how these reservoirs might actually cross the boundary. So in conclusion, the Transboundary Agreement brought certainty, and we don't have to worry about the Western Gap area, and we don't have to worry about the 1.4 nautical mile area. We really are looking just at the transboundary blocks and the ones that will be affected going forward. And of course, it coincides perfectly with Mexico's energy reform and plans for the deepwater offerings pursuant to Round 1, allows for joint exploration, development, production of oil and gas reservoirs in the Gulf, and of course paves the way for additional energy and environmental partnerships. So that concludes my remarks. Thanks very much.
So our next speaker is coming up. He's a speaker that we hope to never hear from again, except in forums like this. Because if you see him on TV, I think the term Houston, we have a problem might be in operation. Scott Lundgren, whose presentation will be on transboundary spill response from the U.S. perspective. So.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the opportunity to speak with you here this morning, and far better to talk under terms of preparedness when it comes to transboundary planning for spill response than in an actual event. Clearly, this is an occasion that none of us want to have happen. Prevention is where the appropriate emphasis. However, we know because of the involvement of humans and technology and the difficulty of proving totally infallible, we do need to have appropriate measures in place for spill preparedness and response, as well as in a transboundary area, which only adds complexity. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the domestic preparedness and response system in the United States, just because I know it's a diverse audience, and to give a very, very brief overview of that, and then how we knit that together with other countries in a series of international plans and conventions with a particular focus on Mexico and the U.S., but then also some of the coordination in the Caribbean, which has also involved Mexico in recent years, and then refer to some capacity building efforts that we have done around the wider Caribbean region. So the United States has a system for both oil and chemical spill response called the National Response System. It's been in place for approximately 40 years and addresses oil and chemicals. Chemicals were added later from any source, and has 15 member agencies that are really party to this overall approach to spill response and preparedness, with Coast Guard and EPA being the lead federal agencies in the system, with EPA having responsibility for inland areas and the U.S. Coast Guard having responsibility for maritime areas. The federal laws provide primacy to the federal government for coordination with states and industry in building together a unified approach, and it very much endorses the polluter pays methodology of response. Not just pays, but polluter plans, prepares, equips, and responds, ultimately carrying out the response under the direction and the oversight of the government, with the ability of funds available for the federal lead to come and step in and augment that if deemed necessary. It has a series of nested and coordinated response plans that help define how the system will operate. And is overall based upon a unified approach to response, bringing together the necessary capability, jurisdictions, and authority that are needed to oversee effective response. And there's really an individual that is at the core of it all from the federal side, the Federal On-Scene Coordinator. Again, that would be from the Coast Guard or EPA in a given spill. I mentioned the nested network of plans, and this diagram outlines that, starting at the top with a regulation, so something that is really foundational and doesn't change very much. The National Contingency Plan is published at 40 CFR and ultimately lays the groundwork for the rest of the national response system. The most significant recent amendment followed Exxon Valdez and the resulting Oil Pollution Act of 1990, and right now there's an amendment that is under consideration. It's out for notice on some changes to the dispersant element of the National Contingency Plan following the Deepwater Horizon incident. It establishes plans at the regional level, the regional contingency plans across 13 federal regions, this 10 standard ones plus the Pacific or Oceania, Caribbean, and Alaska. And then the area contingency plan, where the greatest level of detail is provided, maintained by the federal on-scene coordinator in concert with an area committee consisting of those government representatives that would have involvement in spill response and allowing for input from the private sector, NGOs, and many others at the local level. And really that's where the other plans that come into play are knit together from the facility response plans, a broad term which includes oil spill response plans required by BSEE, vessel response plans, and then connection to state and local plans and other federal internal plans. So this in the center here is really the set of plans of the national response system, and then we also connect into the National Response Framework, which you generally see active in disasters. So essentially this system is one of the emergency support functions. However, we can draw on capabilities that reside and are continually improved within the National Planning Framework's approach. And then also, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, the international joint plans which come into play in transboundary areas. Ultimately, all of this works in an increasing model of preparedness where you develop your plans and policy, bring in the government and industry capabilities that exist, test those out through exercises or through real incidents, ensure you have good after actions, lessons learned, rebuild any of those lessons into your plans, into your training, so that ultimately you have improvement of preparedness over time based upon your experience and your tests through exercises. With stakeholder outreach and engagement, the connectivity of the different elements of the system playing in all of the parts throughout. Now, the need for transboundary spill plans is probably fairly obvious, but oil does not respect national or any jurisdictional boundary and will generally move with the current, and we have some major current regimes that exist in different places. Wind is also a factor, but a relatively small percent. So basically your oil is going to follow currents. The loop current was a major player during the Macondo incident, Deepwater Horizon incident, with it pinching off into an eddy that actually changed the overall dynamic of where the spill may have been heading. That's the underlying reason. You need to have the ability to respond for oil that comes from one jurisdiction to another. And there's one overall international convention that is widely used and seen as a basis for this type of cooperative transboundary planning, called OPRC 1990, or the International Convention on Oil Pollution Preparedness, Response, and Cooperation, which really looks for nations to ensure that they have a domestic system with domestic national contingency plans, and then measures for dealing with that either on a regional or a national basis. It also requires ships to have basic emergency plans. While not a requirement in there, it states that offshore units under jurisdiction should have similar plans, and it ultimately put in place a significant effort at the International Maritime Organization of a technical group that has prepared guidance documents as well as training that is delivered around the country through regional seas programs. 108 nations are party to the convention, and there are some complementary aspects on liability and compensation on the vessel side under Bunkers Convention. It applies to tankers through a series of conventions. Notably, the U.S. isn't a party to those. We have the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 that establishes our own set of funds and liability regime. But for vessels, that's important. It's notable that that doesn't exist for offshore facilities. And I know that issue has been raised at IMO and wrestled with after the Montara incident. Indonesia was pushing that issue. It's something that could very well present itself, particularly in the case of smaller countries that were dealing with oil coming in that was not their own without an overall international regime. So for the United States, we have bilateral plans with our neighboring countries, Canada with 5 separate geographic annexes, Mexico with the Gulf and Pacific plans, Russian Federation for Chukchi Sea and Bering Straits. We have an agreement across the National Response Team to support Panama, recognizing the strategic importance there. And then the rest of our work is on a multilateral basis, either in the Arctic with the 8 Arctic nations and a binding agreement for spill response there. The Caribbean, both contribution to a Caribbean Islands plan, as well as some multilateral operating procedures that I'll mention in a minute that were really driven by Cuba exploration a couple years ago. And then finally, the rest of our work in this field is done with the International Maritime Organization under that OPRC convention, and essentially good guidance type work and information sharing with a lot of our counterparts. So now looking a little bit more into the U.S.-Mexico area, this image, courtesy of the Times-Picayune, but where they overlaid both the area that was ultimately swept by the oil in the Deepwater Horizon incident in red, and then that area affected by the Ixtoc spill back in 1979 with a lower but still sizable discharge over a longer period of time. That did affect the United States and Texas in particular. You'll note that was 1 year before the U.S. and Mexico put into place their exchange that created the Joint Response Team that has led to now our MEXUS plan. The Mexico and United States Joint Contingency Plan, or the MEXUS plan, the most recent version was signed in 2000. It's based upon that underlying 1980 agreement between the nations, establishes a set of standard procedures for response, essentially ensuring we coordinate in response. There are provisions for a joint response. In most cases, we'll be sharing information so that we can achieve an efficient response between the two countries, each overseeing response in their own waters. It is based and rides upon the domestic system that each nation has. So this is not a thick document that you're looking at. It's one that helps knit together the underlying systems. And the two key parties are the Mexican Navy, or CMAR, and the United States Coast Guard. And there are, while the underlying agreement is binding, the two annexes, the MEXUS Gulf and MEXUS PAC, that contain more of the detail are not, but they are supported documents that are more routinely updated and capture the level of detail that is necessary for coordinated response. At the national level, it's my office that has the overarching authority for working with CMAR on the underlying agreement. And then our 8th Coast Guard District out of New Orleans and the CMAR First Naval Zone are the applicable parties for MEXUS Gulf. And then we bring in other interagency partners in exercises, in planning, to help make some of those important connections. Here's a list of some of the recent and the future planned MEXUS exercises. Looking forward in just a couple months, a workshop where we'll be finalizing the latest revision to the MEXUS Gulf JCP and working on hopefully a final, or at least a near final, draft of an update of the MEXUS Joint Contingency Plan that we're working with our Department of State on right now. And then in 2016 and 2017, there's a planned escalation from a tabletop exercise, more discussion-based, to a full-scale exercise, and Anadarko has committed to be the responsible party playing in each of those for, I'll note, a U.S. source event. That summarizes where we are, where we have been under MEXUS. I think there are some actually opportunities to challenge ourselves a little bit more in this field. Energy reform has been a fast-moving and recent phenomenon, and I think there are some lessons that we had learned in our own offshore development major spill regarding the relationship between the response agency, the U.S. Coast Guard, and then Minerals Management Service that has really put us on a very close coordination path with BSEE and working on preparedness and response issues with them. And we've been having presentations from SENAIR on the reform. You'll see a representative from SENAIR at the last MEXUS Gulf seminar to keep us informed, but I think there may be some opportunities for testing that further. Although I think actually moving to a more international regime with majors, there's a lot of common resources that would likely be brought into play, such as the Tier 3 response providers, the well containment and control companies, a number of things that are fairly comfortable in the U.S. that actually may make some of that, some of those elements more common and easier to work with. I see I'm very quickly approaching my time here, so just briefly, there are some steps that we took in the Caribbean that I think may foreshadow the additional work that we'll do, although this was all colored by the challenge of coordination with Cuba, which is particularly constrained for the United States under some of the laws and restrictions. However, we did do a lot of multilateral work beginning with their exploratory drilling in 2011 and 2012 to come up with procedures, a more detailed set of procedures and responder-to-responder network that included both the prevention and the response side of that equation. It really was focused on that offshore exploration and response. And while it's not binding, not signed, and any of those things, it is ultimately the work of the responders and the prevention folks, and it's on one of the regional centers' websites down in the Caribbean, RAC Rempatec, that does a lot of our coordination and outreach. Ultimately, that may have the opportunity to grow beyond the nations that were participating in that first effort of work, which was Mexico, the United States, Cuba, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, recognizing the close proximity of all of those nations. However, there are a lot of smaller nations, small island developing states that could very well be downstream from an incident that may benefit from this work. So we're working with that regional center in the Caribbean for bringing some of these concepts into the wider Caribbean Basin plan that is maintained by the Maritime Center down in Curacao. There's a U.S. Coast Guard officer that's based there, and a significant amount of our contribution to this Cartagena Convention that has the number of states on the last slide, and is a big contribution to the work on the oil spill protocol of that convention to ensure that there is that transboundary preparedness across that wider region. I think with that, I'll just sum up. You heard about the U.S. system and how we knit that together with multiple countries with a particular focus on Mexico. Some of the work in the Caribbean that had really advanced more the prevention and response integration in that, and I see some great opportunities for continuing that on the very strong foundation that we have with MEXUS. So, thank you.
In keeping with the theme of my earlier introduction, I'm assuming it's Doug Morris's job to keep Scott off TV by what he does. And so he was going to talk to us about transboundary safety and enforcement from the U.S. perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. My goal during the next few minutes is to describe the agency, our current and future priorities, and then describe our efforts to work with our counterparts in Mexico to ensure a consistent regulatory regime across the entire Gulf of Mexico. This is our mission statement, which essentially says that we're responsible for ensuring the safe and orderly development of offshore oil and gas resources. We have jurisdiction over oil and gas activities across the entire OCS. However, We have some drilling activities in Alaska, more than 20 platforms in Southern California, but everything else is located in the Gulf of Mexico. We are a relatively new agency. We were formed slightly more than 4 years ago when the old MMS was split into 3 different functions after the Deepwater Horizon incident. Since our formation, we have been aggressively staffing up with technical personnel, and we have more than 800 people located in several different areas across the U.S. Let's discuss some of the regulatory challenges that face BSEE. First, there's a high level of activity on the OCS. We have currently more than 2,500 platforms, which we are required to inspect at least once a year. There are also more than 50 deepwater rigs operating in the Gulf of Mexico, which is a higher number than before Macondo. Second, we regulate a wide range of activities. We have a tremendous variation in the type of facilities, the size of operators, and environmental conditions. But one of the biggest challenges that we face relates to the mandate following Deepwater Horizon that we reform the regulatory process for offshore oil and gas development. The challenge is how do you institute timely, comprehensive regulatory changes without having an adverse impact on existing operations. Many of our current reforms are based on the more than 450 recommendations that we received from various studies that were performed after Deepwater Horizon. Several of these are listed on the slide. First, there was a lot of discussion related to whether or not a prescriptive versus performance-based system is better. We don't believe that there's any right answers to this question. Our approach will continue to be to utilize more of a hybrid approach that uses both prescriptive and performance-based requirements depending on the need. The key issue will be determining the proper balance between the two. Second, consensus standards provide a good starting point to determine acceptable industry practices. We are currently more engaged than in the past in the development and review of these standards. This allows us to identify gaps in the current regulatory framework and determine if additional regulatory changes are needed to supplement industry practices. Third, some equipment is so critical to safety that it must represent the best technology and perform as designed. As a result, we are focusing more on increasing the performance and reliability of critical equipment. And finally, we want to encourage the improvement of safety culture across all operations on the OCS. We're placing special emphasis on ensuring the proper implementation of safety management systems. I think these concepts are consistent with what we heard this morning from Carlos. What's coming up this year? We have a series of regulations that will be coming out. The two big ones that will directly impact deepwater activities are a final rule on production safety systems and a proposed rule on well control and blowout prevention. What's our future direction? Let me quickly mention 5 areas of high interest to the agency. First, the agency will be taking a more analytical approach towards identifying and mitigating risk. This will include increased data collection efforts on near misses and equipment reliability. We'll be placing more emphasis on minimizing process safety risks through various regulatory tools, including safety management systems. And finally, we are taking steps to supplement our current understanding of new emerging technology through internal and external resources. We have instituted a comprehensive training program that makes sure our inspectors and engineers have access to the same quality training programs that are available to the industry. This is a good, solid program. It's constantly improving, and we currently have international regulators that attend these programs. We have also opened the Houston Technology Center, which will provide a valuable resource to the entire agency to evaluate new technology. And finally, we have helped establish the Ocean Energy Safety Institute at Texas A&M. This will provide independent recommendations to the agency on key safety issues. These items will address many of the issues arising out of Deepwater Horizon and should result in better regulatory oversight on the U.S. side of the Gulf of Mexico. Let me discuss our coordination with our counterparts in Mexico. One specific recommendation from the President's Oil Spill Commission was that the agency ensure that there are consistent protections across the entire Gulf of Mexico, not just in U.S. waters. To accomplish this objective, since 2010, the agency has been engaged in a variety of technical workshops and information exchange initiatives with CNH. These are listed on the slide. The goal is not identical requirements. There are simply too many differences in the legal systems to make that happen. The long-term goal is to develop requirements that give an equivalent level of protection across the Gulf of Mexico. I think this is consistent with Section 19 of the agreement, which refers to common and compatible requirements. We have also been participating in the high-level Cooperation Council, which was established by the two governments to increase the economic well-being of both countries through consistent regulations. Offshore oil and gas is one of the 6 areas in which additional cooperation was needed. During the past 2 years, we have worked on issues related to regulations, standards, and data sharing to increase communication between the two countries on offshore development. And I think the third item there related to standards will be addressed this afternoon by David Miller, I believe. And finally, we have been working together as part of the International Regulators Forum. The IRF consists of 11 countries that meet on an annual basis to share best practices and discuss safety issues. The IRF meeting was held in Mexico last year, and this year it's going to be held in Washington, D.C. Provides a mechanism for regulators from the U.S. and Mexico to compare the programs that they are currently using to those that are used in the rest of the world. Great place to share information. And if looking on this list, I guess the key focus again is on regulation, standards, and data sharing. In summary, we have relatively new agencies with evolving regulatory programs on both sides of the boundary. We have a common goal of increasing the safety, environmental protection across the entire Gulf of Mexico through better cooperation and better alignment and increased sharing of data and best practices. Many of the details related to joint inspections and compatible safety and environmental requirements that are needed to implement the Transboundary Agreement will need to be worked out in future discussions, and that's likely to take time to fully implement. However, the good news is that the framework is currently in place to help expedite this process. That's all I have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We certainly have time for some questions. Unfortunately, my mental acuity is not equal Duncan's, so we'll just take one question at a time and try to answer. I don't think I can remember 3 or 4. It's beyond me. I don't want to stress my panel. I know they can handle it, but yes, please.
Mark Walton from Wood Mackenzie. Mr. Lundgren, you mentioned the Ixtoc oil spill. Now, I know a lot of people remember that. They're very similar in terms of Macondo, and it's 4 million versus 3 million. But the main difference is that it took 10 months for the Mexican for Timex to pretty much remediate and drill the Yellowbait wells that they needed to fix that. And the BP Horizon took about 3 months. So with an area that's, I guess, delicate in terms of for both countries, is there any plans to speed up the, I want to say the response rate in case one of these things happen again?
And Certainly, if somebody from BSEE would like to jump in, that aspect of well capping and intervention is not in the Coast Guard's remit, but there has been a tremendous amount of work done to ensure intervention, not just relief wells, but ensuring you have capping stacks and other methodologies of, flow and intercept type systems, so that while you may not be immediately stopping the flow, you're at least capturing the oil at the source rather than dealing with it by drilling a relief well. And certainly you looked at the size, the depth and pressure and flow rate was substantially different, but the much greater period of time with the ICSTOC. So I think that's an area where there have been significant improvements in capacity in the Gulf of Mexico and globally on that, which is certainly a very important advancement.
And I think that concept is consistent with our discussions currently with our counterparts in Mexico. Again, it's focused on prevention. That's why we are engaged in sharing best practices, information, the best industry standards, and that'll continue, because I think we want to make sure that we're addressing Gulf of Mexico issues, not just transboundary issues.
Please. Okay, can you hear me? Okay. If by any chance you can't hear me, because I move a lot, I know Mexicans move a lot when they speak, so let me know, it's not rude. An interesting thing is gonna start happening in case an oil spill happens now, because the fact that now you have private companies doing the drilling in the Mexican side, they might be found liable in the United States for any of the damages that can occur from that. As you know from the ICSTOC case, when that all happening, there was a huge discussion in the United States about whether you could sue Pemex, or was Pemex acting as the entity of the Mexican government, or it would fall under the Immunities Act. So at least now with the energy reform, you have private operators that could be liable. So there's going to be a better response, and it's going to be in their interest to do a better response, because they can be found liable in the United States. So I think that's going to change the dynamics. I mean, comparing now with the ICSTOC case.
One minute.
Yeah, with respect to this question, I was in charge of giving the permits for drilling in Mexico. So we started asking for many safety requirements for Pemex to do the drilling in the deep waters. So we asked for the capping stack and all these things that they have been asking in that part of the U.S. And we also started, as you were saying before, with this exercise for planning how to deal with the spill. So we have been in contact with Bessie and Coast Guard doing this, and we have now a plan of how to respond in the case of an spill. We don't have it that when the ICSTOC occurred.
May I just add, and this is really more of a question than anything else.
You're allowed. This
That's
okay.
I was hoping that, but this is my only opportunity, so I'll throw it out there. That another issue involving ICSTOC and also the Deep Horizon was the OPA, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990's requirement that in order for foreign nationals to get compensation in case there was a transboundary spill, that they had to have domestic laws that were reciprocal or similar to those in the United States. And my question is, as part of the energy reform, and you mentioned that there is this fund now in Mexico, do you have in place something that would allow Mexican nationals to be able to claim from the OPA fund? In other words, do you have something similar in Mexico at this point? Or are we still in a situation where if there is a transboundary spill that Mexican nationals would not be able to claim anything under the U.S. fund? Could anyone answer that? Does anybody? And if not, my apologies. So.
No, well, it's a good question. Maybe need to be addressed.
We're working in modify our laws, so to homologate it with the U.S. Requirement or regulations. So perhaps we don't have it now, but we will have it.
Yes, sir.
I'm George Baker. I publish an industry newsletter on Mexico. I wonder if anyone has an idea as to whether Pemex will be subject to Chapter 10 of NAFTA when it's no longer a government agency but is a state enterprise. Chapter 10 of NAFTA deals with procurement. Is Pemex still subject to the procurement rules of NAFTA under this new legal regime? That's the question.
See, I think it's called Stump the Panel right now. You got two of them.
That's a great question. I think one of the steps as an academic that we have to start analyzing is how NAFTA is going to change now that, Pemex is no longer what it is. All the rules for foreign investment, all the bilateral investment treaties that Mexico had signed excluded the energy sector because it was considered part of a state immunities. Now it's no longer. So all those new aspects that are going to basically are changing our previous framework regarding foreign investment and our previous framework with NAFTA. And I can't answer directly your question, but I think it's something that is still pending and to be analyzed.
I think if nothing else, this panel has just generated a lot of billable hours for some individuals. Yes, Tony.
Hi, thanks to the panel. My name is Tony Knapp. I'm professor of geosciences at Texas A&M University. I've only been in Texas for 20 months. And I'm also on the board of a number of insurance and reinsurance companies in Bermuda, so we end up paying for quite a few of these after collecting a reasonable amount of money for it. But I run an observing system for the state of Texas, and it's sort of unique. It's with buoys and gliders and HF radars, and coastal protection takes money. And one of the things the Texas government or state have done, I guess it's the only state that's allowed to fly its flag with the U.S. flag.
Oh, in fact, it does a lot of things in that area.
Under the Coastal Protection Fund in 1991, it put aside 1.3 cents per barrel of crude oil that's loaded or unloaded in Texas ports. And that money is quite an unusual tax because it's actually used to do something that's positive, right? It actually goes to fund science in oil spill protection, to fund buoys, to fund studies, etc., so that Texas is ready for a spill. And they realized in 1991 that they weren't ready, so they formed this. So I'm wondering if that model, number one, has anyone heard of such a tax going to that? And the second question is, should Mexico perhaps consider having something too? Because it's not a huge amount of money, but I can tell you, and it's never amount of money for a scientist, but it does work. And I'm just wondering whether that sort of coastal protection has been or a way to fund coastal protection. Does anyone know anything about that? So I apologize for the long comment and the question, but
No, that's good. Any response back from me? Yes.
Yeah, I might offer a little and welcome others to do the same. One of the elements in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 is it didn't forbid states from establishing their own regimes as well. And so there are a number of states that have collected money on oil imports. I think a lot depends on how much they funnel that back toward the system and the regime itself versus have it as general receipts into the fund, and you sort of see examples of both. The Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund as well. It was a creation at the federal level, which was also generated by a tax on oil, and ultimately is there and available for pay in the case of an incident. A small amount does go each year to several of the federal agencies that ultimately fund some of the baseline systems, but it doesn't provide phenomenal amounts on the preparedness end for that. There were a couple of significant science and research related agreements following Deepwater Horizon, both the National Academy of Sciences and the GOMRI, the Gulf of Mexico Research Institute, so a total of $1 billion over 10 and 30 years, respectively. So there's a lot, post-incident being channeled into the specific geographic area. Now, taxes and the popularity are a hotly debated topic, so I won't talk about the wisdom of those. That's up to the politicians to determine. But you see it different ways as to how much it does get channeled back into the system itself or broader uses.
And I would just say, on the Mexican side, I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but at least the way I understand the trust that was created, even though there is no tax that is going to be used for technology, the trust that was created that is going to, benefit from all the profits made out of the reform has a section that is dedicated for technology. Some of the money from there has to be dedicated to technology as well. So.
Any other questions? Comments? Excellent. Well, before we thank a panel and join for lunch, I had a question earlier about the presentations and their availability on our website like that, and I know that we sought permission from our speakers to do that, and those who gave us that permission, and I know that I'm certain they will be on the Wilson Center and HRS site, Heart Research site, and probably others, but they will be available for you to find that those have given us those permissions, so you can access as well. Please join me in thanking the panel. And now the most popular statement of the morning, let's adjourn for lunch.